Good afternoon and welcome to Invariant's 16th Dialogue for Change on building a strong and sustainable work culture. If you have a question for our panelists throughout the event, please type it into the chat box. The Dialogue for Change is a series that facilitates conversations on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for companies and members of the policy community interested in engaging on relevant cultural and business issues. I'm Caroline Swan, Chief People Officer at Invariant. I lead all elements of Invariant's people function, including employee experience, leadership development and training, talent acquisition, management, strategic planning, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives. Before Invariant, I oversaw employee experience programming at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, most recently leading the organization through a strategic reorganization to meet both the employee and the needs of the organization in a post-pandemic world. Today, we're going to be talking about company culture and the post-pandemic workplace. According to Gartner, with employees working in distributed environments, more often executive leaders are worried about the organization's culture if it will become fragmented and weaker, leading to lower levels of engagement, performance, and innovation. In many cases, companies are mandating a return to in-person in order to maintain the company culture. Interestingly, though, research shows that hybrid workers among all types of employees are doing the best when it comes to feeling connected to their organization's culture. The focus for organizations in 2023 shouldn't be on mandating a return to the office, but on working out how to build a strong culture in a new and sustainable way. Today's conversation will serve as a roadmap for companies seeking to increase employee engagement, foster belonging, empower managers to build culture, and better communicate about return to work policies. So with that, I'm pleased to move the conversation to the conversations portion of today's event, a discussion with three experts in building strong workplace culture. First, I want to welcome Bernard Coleman. He's the Chief Diversity and Engagement Officer at Gusto, where he leads the employee engagement team, which encompasses diversity, equity, and inclusion, employee relations, and people, integrity, governance, and compliance functions. Prior to Gusto, Bernard led diversity efforts at Uber, and before that directed Hillary for America's HR and D&I efforts. And he was the first ever Chief Diversity and HR Officer in US history for any presidential campaign. His insights have appeared in Time, the New York Times, Forbes, Inc., TechCrunch, and USA Today. Also with us is Kate Lister. She's president of Global Workplace Analytics, a research-based consulting firm that has been helping organizations optimize flexibility and distributed work for nearly 2 decades. She's a trusted source of insights about the future of work for news outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and dozens of others. As a recognized thought leader, Kate was one of only 3 witnesses invited to testify before a U.S. Senate committee regarding the potential for remote work in government once the pandemic ends. And finally, we have Marie Silla-Dixon. She is the global head of D&I for the Amazon Media and Entertainment Division, which includes Prime Video, Amazon Studios, MGM, music, gaming, Twitch, and Audible businesses. She is a lawyer, DE&I, and former government relations and C-suite executive. Armed with a keen eye for innovation and the intersection of public policy, community investment, and business, Marie leverages her more than 20 years of experience in government affairs, public affairs, social impact, and DE&I to create synergistic outcomes for employees, customers, companies, and communities. Welcome and thank you all for being here. I've been looking forward to this discussion. Let's just go ahead and dive in. The importance of fostering employee well-being and engagement and belonging is at an all-time high. Employees want to feel valued as people, not just for productivity. They demand increased flexibility and choice. Kate, my first question is for you. How can employers improve engagement and belonging at work across a hybrid work environment?
Well, you mentioned it earlier. It turns out that hybrid has the highest level of engagement of any of the work modes. And that's been true for 10 years at least. When people measured it, it was the folks that had the opportunity to work remotely, even if they didn't use it, which is interesting, just having the choice. So engagement is a measure So what we really need to look at is what are the things that contribute to it. And what we've learned over the years is that it's same thing Maslow said just about autonomy, mastery, and choice, or autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So, I mean, the autonomy is let them choose where and when they work, and when is actually more important than where. They want to be able to flex their schedules. Again, that's been true for 10, 15 years. And it means stop micromanaging. It means trusting people to do their work, stop worrying about productivity, and learn how to manage by results. So, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things that organizations can do is teach their managers to manage, teach their managers to be coaches. Funny, Martha Johnson was the head of the USGSA back when they were renovating a building and moved it from 2,500 people to 4,200 people as a result of allowing distributed work and flexibility. And she said, telework doesn't create management problems, it reveals them. And so what the pandemic revealed are a lot of things, including managers not being able to manage, and that's why they're uncomfortable. On the mastery side, people really want to do a good job. I mean, we want to be successful. So it means giving them the tools and the technologies that they need to be successful, and the training, which most organizations have not done. And then purpose, constant. I've talked to some of the companies that do they're all virtual. And how do you connect to purpose? It's part of every conversation. When we get on a call, we go through how does this connect to our values? You need to be a lot more intentional about it in a hybrid work environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's so interesting, and I agree. And I think there's also got to be some sort of psychological safety, right? That they feel comfortable and confident and engaging. And so that brings me to my next question. I'm going to pose this to Bernard. And that is, Bernard, that psychological safety is defined as the ability to show and employ oneself without fear of any negative consequences, self-image, status, or career. And I'm just curious, tell me how you think leaders and managers can create a psychologically safe space for employees.
Yeah, I mean, I think psychological safety is paramount. I think it does start with leaders, because they can set the tone. Either they can set a tone that's fosters that, or it causes a chilling effect where people shut down and they don't feel safe, right? So I call psychological safety the space to succeed and the grace to fail, because I think if I have the space to succeed and I know failure, not fatal, right? I think I'll be more apt to go for it, right? And I think what's really important is being vulnerable as a leader. And I could talk about what I do in practice. Like I try to give people more insights into what I'm thinking, what I'm going through. So it doesn't seem as like if I'm going in there and I'm stoic, and it seems like I'm not vulnerable and I'm infallible, what message is that to my team? What message that is to the folks on this team? That they'll feel like I can't fail, it's not safe. So really, you have to model the behaviors you want to see in your team to be more impactful. And I think by creating those conditions, people see that it's safe, and then they're going to mirror what they're seeing, and then the culture of psychological safety is codified. But I think if you aren't doing that, if you aren't as the leader setting the tone and doing those best practices, I think you kind of missing the mark, and then you wonder why your team maybe shuts down, right? Or they're not giving the ideas, or they're not being as impactful. And a lot of organizations obviously want to have high performing teams, but if you've effectively shut down conversation and made failing so fatal, you actually are doing the opposite. So psychological safety, I think, is a key unlock in terms of having a high performing team, but also making people just feel seen and valued.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And I think your point about modeling that behavior is so important, and something we all need to think about and to be intentional about I think is really key. I also think, touching back to what Kate had mentioned about purpose is also a key piece too, right? So having that safety and also feeling that sense of purpose are really two big key points in bringing your best self to work. And so I'm going to pose this question for Marie. Marie, younger generations especially are looking for that personal fulfillment at work. And I'm just curious, how do you think employers can create a sense of purpose, and what role does that foster in sort of connecting with each other and creating that connection to work?
Well, Caroline, thank you for that question. And I think Kate hit it on the nail a second ago when she said companies really have to align the work with the values. Millennials, the younger generation, make up half of our workforce, and they really value well-being and they value work-life balance. And we're seeing that now, even when we went through or are going through, the Great Resignation. They also care about issues like sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion, and also how companies are showing up on social justice issues. So it's really essential for companies right now to show how their work or services or products have an impact not only on customers, but also the world. And with that, it's also important for them to show how the work that each and every employee is doing is helping to contribute to making either generational change or societal change. Employees, especially younger employees, have options, they have choices, and they are very, very conscious. They also want to see transparency and accountability from leadership and from organization. I think that's something new, and that's really important. That's come up in the past couple of years. Also, going back to your question, you asked about, how can companies play a role in fostering that connection? I think that it's really important for companies to play a role in that, because this generation, especially the Gen Zers, were like the first digital generation. And so when we think about fostering that connection, again, it really goes back to tying back the work with how each and every employee is driving that work and has a role to play in that mission or vision and that purpose. I mean, that's essential. And those connections, when you do that and you have that sense of purpose, I think also for these employees in particular, it helps to lead to higher engagement, and also higher retention. And it's really essential right now for that workforce more than ever, because they have choices and they want to be, they're very conscious of how they spend their time. And, the workplace is a big one. So it is one that they want to, they feel like they want to impact generations, and it's a legacy that they want to leave behind. And I would also say that this mindset has also shifted even with baby boomers and even with Gen Xers. And we saw it, I think, because of the pandemic, where you had people who either retired or they went into different types of work. So that connection and that purpose, I think, is essential and really essential for companies right now to step up.
That's great. And
I'm sorry.
Marie, oh, go ahead. Sure.
The story I love was President Kennedy walking down the hall and bumping into a janitor, and the president saying, "So what do you do here?" And he says, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon."
Yeah, it's a great story and one that I love. So excellent point, Kate, and thanks for mentioning. I think going back to something that you said, Marie, one thing I want to talk about is more of women and people of color. And so according to Harvard Business Review, women and people of color are far more likely to want to prefer hybrid and fully remote work. There's overt acts of sexism and racism and even subtle dynamics, feeling like they can't be themselves completely in the office. So when you were talking about, the individuals really, especially the younger generations, having a choice and really wanting that transparency and wanting to be engaged, it's really important that we all consider about marginalized workers and giving them a sense of belonging in the workplace, right? And how we can make employees with disabilities and LGBTQIA employees feel like they have a part in work. And they tend to prefer a hybrid work environment because they feel like they can't bring their full self to work. So Kate, I'm going to turn to you for just a moment. You talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I thought, maybe this might be a good question for you. How might the return to the office, including hybrid models, exacerbate any sort of existing inequalities? And what ways can we mitigate that or stop those issues so individuals can really bring their whole selves to work?
Yeah, I think it could go two ways, and it might go both as well. Unfortunately, about half of managers say they will likely favor people they see every day for compensation, for career moves, for the best projects and all of that. And so if that happens, that we've got the marginalized folks that are going to be working more at home, we've really got to be careful that we don't create this second class of workers. And there's just so many things. I could go on for an hour of just all the tiny little things that you need to think about in every meeting, in every communication. It has to do with the technology that you use and the examples that you set in your own the way you work. The other side is that we can reach more people, the underemployed. I'm doing a keynote for a group in Ireland in June, and they love this because people are able to stay in their own communities rather than having to move to the big overcrowded cities. So, I think one of our biggest risks going forward is the risk of creating those two classes of citizens. I mean, people during the pandemic who felt marginalized before actually felt better. We're all the same size square on the screen. And early on, there was a lot of communication from the CEO sitting there in his armchair, and you can see what's back here, and the dog goes through, and it sort of created this sense of empathy and humanity. And I think that, we need to recapture what those things were, recapture those good things, and be sure to take them forward.
Right. And I think that's such an excellent point, because it really was in some ways the great equalizer, right? As to your point on having the same squares and reaching so many different audiences that typically we couldn't, and people feeling like, there was a lot of leveling of the playing field, if you will. And that brings me to Marie. Marie, I want to go back. How can hybrid work environments, just as we were talking about, strengthen long-term DE&I efforts? Similar to what Kate and I were saying, is there some ways in which, hybrid work might really actually help with DE&I? And how do we balance those challenges with the benefits of it?
Well, the hybrid model, especially right now, it disproportionately, what we're seeing, and I think based on the data out there, is it disproportionately has a positive impact on diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, as well as performance. First, it opens up the talent pool, especially to historically marginalized people. And now, businesses can seek out employees in different geographies and location. And we saw this with the number of tech companies, for example, hiring people in different locations. But it's also offered a lot more flexibility to historically underrepresented groups and people of color and women and those with disabilities who prefer a hybrid model. And one of the things that I did also want to talk about, I think someone may have raised this earlier, is that there's data out there that shows that 70% of men and women express stronger preferences, but we're really seeing the data with members of the LGBTQ plus employees, Black, Latino employees, and women who are really preferring a hybrid model. And part of that has to do with the culture in the past, especially with dealing with microaggressions and feeling like they weren't in a safe space. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about DE&I and the efforts, the hybrid model also is helping to alleviate some of that for our employees. I would also, just to what Kate said earlier about Ireland also, is it also kind of helps to level the playing field in some ways. But I'll get back to that in a second. But also with employees outside of the US, it also can allow for more connection points because of different time zones. When you have employees who are, working from home, where they have a little bit more flexibility to do more work with more global time zones as well. And in addition, it also helps, I think, for companies to shift the hybrid workplace way, that shifting in a way to make it more inclusive, but it also allows for more flexibility, more work-life balance. You know, I'm a working mother who had a small child, so I remember what it was like going into the office and being in traffic for 2 hours and spending a lot of that time and then coming home late, where most of that time I would have been more productive in front of the, you know, the computer and doing the work. And so in a lot of ways, companies are getting more out of workers, and you're working even more, but you're also having, you know, that flexibility. One thing I do want to touch on, and I think Kate brought this up, is one of the challenges with the model can be proximity. You know, sometimes there tends to be a bias that comes from employees who view certain employees who come into the office more. And so we have to be very careful, and leaders have to really be intentional about checking themselves to make sure that there isn't bias. So when it comes to like stretch assignments or, you know, promotions, and not, you know, shifting that mindset and looking at the first person next to them. So we have to be very intentional about checking that bias. And also, secondly, we have to think about being a lot more inclusive when we're in a hybrid work model, especially if you have half of a you know, group in at a meeting and the other half on a Zoom or a Chime. And so we have to make sure that we think about ways of how we're being inclusive in our practices. So
If I can just give a couple examples of that, I mean, really simple stuff, like the person that is remote in that meeting should have a buddy in the room so that they can, you know, text them or whatever, if they can bring them into the conversation. It turns out that introverts had an easier time during the pandemic because, you know, I don't really feel like breaking into the conversation, but I can put my hand up with the little, you know, either my real hand or with the little animation. And so using those kinds of tools, using polls so that, you know, people who don't want to speak up can have a say. And so it's sort of, you know, increasing the diversity in the brain pool. And there's just lots of little things like that, you know, we've really got to be conscious of.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I agree with that 100%, what you just said. The other thing I just wanted to point out is when you are on Zoom, and I love the concept of having a buddy there, because one of the things that we noticed, especially during the pandemic, you had a lot of people starting new jobs. And so that was a challenge because there's such a thing as earning trust. Well, how do you earn trust when you don't have those connections? And especially for people of color, people with disabilities, and marginalized groups who didn't have, you know, who started a lot of these new positions, and there was a lot of hiring. It was difficult. It's hard already to come into an organization to navigate a culture, but I think it's also even more difficult when you're navigating that culture and trying to establish that trust in, you know, that hybrid remote work. So that's where I think leaders have to be intentional and really try to think outside the box on how they connect and get leaders and colleagues and peers in the same room and kind of establish those connections.
Yeah, I think such good ideas, Kate, and I loved hearing that about the raising the hand and having a buddy. Those are fantastic. And Maria, I couldn't agree more. It really, the issues of trust, it's just so key and paramount to anybody being successful. I love this conversation. I'm going to shift it just for a little bit to Bernard. Bernard, I'm curious, you know, we talked about ways for inclusion as people are remote, but, you know, people are returning back to the office. And so as they return to the office, how can we create a better sense of belonging and inclusion as people come back? Because people were accustomed to being remote and using those, you know, opportunities and things, and that feeling that great sense of equality, being in that same size box as the CEO. But now as we return, there's that sensitivity around, am I going to feel like I'm belonging? Am I going to feel included in things? And so I'm just curious, what's your perspective on how we can do that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and it's something I've been looking at because I think we're all actively doing the return to office and what that looks like, how many days a week, what are the things we should be fostering, and I think you have to look at community and connection in both acts and deeds. And I think what I mean by that is like understanding what engagement is to the whole through line of somebody's employee experience, like what brought you in. Because a lot of times we're courting employees and what we did to hire them, we don't necessarily continue through the rest of the experience, but you continue to do those things that made them want to work in the first place. So I think it should be values aligned. And I think it's really important to understand what's working, what's not working. Because I think a lot of people are like demanding back at the office and not thinking about what's next. And so I think a lot of times when we think about it before the pandemic, we went to the office because our stuff was there, our monitors, maybe our leaders, our coworkers. So a lot of those things aren't necessarily there. We aren't all there in the same time. So I think it's also being more, we spoke about intention, being intentional with our time when we're meeting with folks. Like, is it Innovation Tuesdays or Network Wednesdays, whatever the day is. Like, I think people should be very intentional about those community and connection moments, because the thing that I know, everyone needs human contact. It varies person to person, but I think you should create those moments. And by creating those spaces so that when people do return to office, I am returning to community, I am returning to connection and those important points that I need just to be successful, right? I think when we get away from that, it just feels like you're not qualifying why we're returning to the office. And it feels very much like, so why am I here? I think Marie was talking about, like, I lost 2 hours of driving. I could have been more productive at home. Like, why are we qualifying this coming back to the office if it's not as productivity, if we're not having the productivity? And I do think community and connection are it. I mean, ultimately that's engagement. So I think it's really about exercising inclusive actions, right? So when people are there, you're trying to do those gatherings, you're coming together. Like at my office place, like I work in tech, so we have like free lunch every day. So we try to huddle together and have lunch. And I tell my team I'm coming on a Wednesday. So we try to coordinate so that we're more effective. So we're not all meeting on Zoom if we can meet in person. So I think it's really about doing the things that when we were courting staff to join the company, continuing to do those better things, and then constantly measuring. Like, you should be measuring what's working, what's not working. Because again, this is, you're kind of feeling around the dark, trying to find that light switch, the right switch that makes this work for most people. Because I think at the end of the day, if engagement impacts impact and output, what are you doing to foster greater engagement, right? So I think there's definitely a correlation. So I think by doing those actions, you'll have a better response, and it'll be better received, as opposed to, all right, I'm here, no one else is here, what are we doing? And then I just stay at home, right?
Right. Yeah, I know. I often heard when we were all starting, and not at Invariant, but elsewhere and around, many people would say to me, why do we need to come back if I'm just going to be doing a Zoom meeting from my desk when I could be at home? And to Marie's point, I could be using that time to be more productive. And if productivity went up when we were remote, then what are we doing here? And shouldn't we be trying to keep at that level of productivity? But studies have also shown that productivity went way up as well because of people's concerns about what's going to happen in the pandemic and am I being as helpful? And it was their way to get that sense of community, to your point, Bernard, to feel that sense of community in a time of real disruption and uncertainty. And so I'm really loving this conversation, and I'm really just curious. I want to ask the group, do you all think that remote work will last? Is it here to stay? 5 years from now, what do we think it's going to look like? Bernard, I'll start with you.
I do think it's here to stay. I have some theories, though. Like, I think Gen Z is very interesting. So my theory is this: like, I remember after the Great Recession happened, I remember reading about the young people entering the workforce. They saw their parents' life savings get wiped out, and I've read that there's now there as a result those younger folks are savers because they don't want that to ever happen to themselves. So if you go with me on this, I think because Gen Z is not in the office and they aren't getting perhaps how we all came to the office and we learned from our peers and we got the on-the-job training, if they feel that they were denied that, when they become managers themselves, I think they're going to have a greater demand for wanting people to come back to the office. So I can see the pendulum shifting. But I do think remote work, to some degrees, has to stay because it is a talent unlock. You can reach different geographies. You can reach different audiences where like maybe hiring was scarce. So I think it's going to still be some mix, but I do think the Gen Z preference might tip it. I'm just guessing.
Okay. No, I think you're right. I think that also the opportunity for talent pools that normally we couldn't tap into is a big piece. Kate, I'm curious, what do you think? Do you think remote work is here to stay, and what will it look like in 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I've been pushing this rock uphill for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
And 3 years ago, it started chasing me down the other side. I think that 5 years, 2 years, 3 years from now, it's just, we're not going to call it remote work. It's just how we work. I don't like the word remote anyway, because it feels remote. Hybrid feels, I don't know, like a car. I like the word distributed. But anything we do to improve the way people are working, I mean, all the things we were just talking about right now, these are things that are going to improve work regardless of whether or not you're remote or whether you're on site. I mean, whether you're 9 floors, 9 miles, or 9 time zones away, we're already working with people that we're not together with. So these are all skills and all technologies that we need to adopt regardless of where people work. The pandemic showed, at least in the US, that about 60% of employees had a job that could be done remotely at least some of the time. 80 to 90% of people want to, at least some of the time. That number has held up since 20 years ago. That hasn't changed. Actually, it did go up a little. It was more like 70 to 80%. Now it's 80 to 90%. In fact, it continued to go up during the pandemic. About 10 to 20% want to be in the office full time. About 20 to 30% want to be full-time remote, although the managers are kind of wanting a little bit less of that. And so that balance of 50-60 are going to be hybrid. Managers are pushing for 1 to 2 days a week at home. Employees are pushing for 3 to 4 to 5 days a week at home. We're going to land it somewhere in the middle. And guess what? Historically, it's been 2.5 days a week for people that did it. And that's actually where it has been since about last July. There's a company called Castle that does badge data. Looked at the badge data all over the country, and they continue to every week. And that needle hasn't moved above, well, it got to 50% at one point, but it's hovering there around 45 to 50% of people, buildings being occupied compared to how they were before the pandemic. But one of the problems is they were only 50 to 60% occupied before the pandemic. And so if you run those numbers, that means buildings are only 25% occupied. And so you've got ghost towns, and you sit there, like Marie said, and say, why did I bother to come in? And that's what companies are struggling with right now. Some of my clients are also reconfiguring the floor space and saying, look, we know that people say they're more productive at home. So let's have them do their focus work at home. And when they come in, let's be intentional about building community. And so putting in more social areas, like Bernard said, having lunch together, forcing those social activities when people are in the office.
Yeah, it's true. Marie, I want to give you a shot here. Tell me about what you think the future of work is.
So I think it's here to stay. I think that the workers today, especially that younger generation that's making up 50%, they're going to leave an organization if they can't have that flexibility. So I think it's here to stay. I think what's going to happen is I think companies or organizations need to really think outside the box about experiences, outside connections to bring employees together, and not just employees, even if employees have families. I think you have to figure out, how do you get people together so they can build those connections? And that's important in a remote or a hybrid environment, because sometimes, as we can see, especially with well-being, that, people feel isolated at times if they're, working in front of a computer all day and they're not getting to see their colleagues or peers, just to have, a regular check-in or conversation. I also think we also have to pay attention to, when Kate was talking about the badges, is who's swiping those badges, because as we saw, disproportionately, people of color are not the ones who are going to have the luxury of working from home. And so I think we have to pay very close attention to that in the future. But I think it's here to stay. I think we have to get very creative about how we create those really intentional connections, because that's the piece that I worry about as we move into this environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think one of the pieces that's so important to creating those connections and that culture is really, it comes down to managers, right? They're that first line. There's a psychologist, Daniel Goleman, and he says it's not the ratio of office to home days that matters to employees, it's how they feel about the workplace. And how you feel about the workplace comes down to your day-to-day interactions with your manager. They really have a huge influence in how you feel about coming to work. Kate, I'm going to go back to you. How can managers support employees, especially underrepresented employees, just as we were just talking about, across a hybrid workplace? Has the role of manager changed since the pandemic? Have they been able to really, help underrepresented employees feel more engaged? I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, one touch point from what Marie was saying, we've sort of ignored all of the essential workers. Everybody's talking about hybrid. They don't get to be hybrid. And if we were working with a client before the pandemic on a flexibility program, it would have been flexibility for all. So, you need to create opportunities for those on-site workers, be it choose your own break times, start and end, flexible start and end times, days off, hours off instead of full days. There's lots of ways that you can build flexibility, and it really has to be something for all, or we're going to get yet another divide of we and them. I think managers' job should be sure that their people are in sync with what they're supposed to be doing and how it will be measured. So, that gets to the results-based management, and then that should be tied to, and what are the goals of the bigger organization. They need the tools and the resources to do their best work. There's this big argument at the beginning of the pandemic. Should we give them a ergonomic chair? Should we give them a second monitor? Well, you could pay for 300 ergonomic chairs for the cost of one workers' comp claim. and you could pay for a second monitor if the person using it gains 2 minutes a day as a result of having that second monitor. And ditto, when they come into the office, they need access to those kinds of things. Companies are going to save money. We went with this. We estimate that a typical company can save about $11,000 for every half-time remote employee. And they've got to plow some of that back into training and back into those resources that are going to make people successful. And then I think the other job of a manager is to get all of the crap out of the way that keeps people from doing their best. And so that's favoritism, it's bullying, it's microaggressions, it's giving them a comfortable working environment, and giving them opportunities to learn and give back from others. Saying to their people, what do you need? How can I help?
Right. And that comes down to that, compassion and empathy. And I think really being careful and thoughtful to asking the question of, how are you doing today? Before we jump into the work, how are you doing? It's so key and important to just speaking to the person and not just to an employee and thinking of the productivity, right? And so, Bernard, I'm going to switch it to you. I want to ask you, how can managers, get the performance from their teams, but show that empathy and that compassion as well. It's a balance, and I think we're asking a lot of managers in this moment during this time of change. But I'm just curious to get your perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think being empathetic, again, going back to the psychological safety, helps kind of set the tone. I like to use, when the pandemic began, I began using, instead of jumping into formal agendas and updates, like really actually checking in, like authentically, not like, hey, how are you doing? Okay, back to the bullet items on this sheet, but really just checking in with people. And I think that, again, that they drop the walls and they're more, I'm kind of more attuned to where they are and what they need, right? And I think it makes it, again, more safe. And then when we get to the actual agenda items, I can do what I do real talk. It's like, what's really going on is what they're doing actually driving toward whatever our objectives are? And I can kind of go more deeply, but we could have more of a frank conversation because they know. I think the most important thing is that I'm a caring manager. So I think when you think your manager cares and you have more frank conversations, then you can have more honest discussions about what's blocking you, where you're succeeding, what your issues are. But I think you actually could help unblock and actually drive them towards outcomes and discuss like what's really going on versus kind of being very, what's the best word I'm looking for? Very surface with it. So you have to get beneath the surface. And when you think about it, like the data, this is from Gallup, but they talk about the 5 drivers of engagement. They talk about purpose. Like, so we've talked about that already. You know, what we do and why we do it, that matters to people and where they derive their work. They also talk about development. Like I need to grow my skills. I want to grow knowledge and competencies, but I want to, like, that shows me that you're willing to invest in me and that I'm valued, right? So I think you get more of an unlock from people. Right, when they say I'm trying to aspire to this, the empathy is me. Like, what can I do to help connect them to their goals, right? Their professional achievements, whatever that might be. And I said a caring manager, but like it goes without saying, if I trust you, I mean, it goes a long, long way in terms of just having that loyalty, right? That prevents attrition, right? I might go the extra mile, and those ongoing conversations. Again, like to me, that's like ongoing. Quality assurance, right? So like we're kind of checking in, and if the direction is north, but now it's northeast, I can help move them in the right direction through our ongoing conversations versus dramatic shifts because I'm constantly checking in. And it doesn't feel like micromanaging, it's more like being hands-on. And I think finally is focusing on people's strengths. Like obviously, you're not always going to get to do what you want as an employee, but I think if you can align those two things, like, you know, in graduate school was about, is it a competitive advantage or my absolute advantages? If I'm pushing them towards what they're absolutely great at, setting them up for success, and I'm aligning those interests, and it not only helps that person, it not only helps the team, but it helps the organization because all those things are going in the right direction. So I think that all comes from empathy. And I think that's why those 5 drivers of engagement, as Gallup pointed out, are really, really quite impactful in terms of employee success, team success, and organizational success.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think coming with that empathy and the individual feeling that, you know, you have their back and you're supportive of them and their success is your success is so key. And so I think excellent points, Bernard, really, really good. And so I'm going to turn to Marie really quick, because Bernard you talked about psychological safety, and Marie, I'd love to get your perspective. Building off of what Bernard just talked about in terms of the Gallup 5 drivers of engagement and that psychological safety, and how do you think managers can create safe spaces for team members?
So I think Bernard and Kate both said this, it really does start with the leader at the top to model those types of behavior. It is safety, I think, I mean, it's respect, it's valued, but safety is critical and essential for every single employee of an organization, especially if you want to get the best out of that person. So I think creating a safe space means, you know, allowing employees and people to speak up and not feeling fearful that something will happen to them. So, you know, when you think about imposter syndrome, that's happened to me, that's happened to a lot of us, especially women and people of color, who, you know, go in and don't feel safe to speak up. So how do you as a leader recognize that and make it and model that behavior so that individuals and people know they can speak up and they can feel safe? I mean, it's, you know, no question is dumb. So you have to have, you know, that type of safe environment and model that that behavior. And I think other things, you know, for example, if there's, you know, meetings, I mean, you know, if you see microaggressions, if you see certain behavior, I think you have, as a leader or even as an individual or anyone, you need to call out that behavior. Because ultimately, an environment for an employee, it has to be safe in order for that person to really be authentic, to really contribute. I also think someone touched on this earlier about check-ins. When we think about a safe environment, there could be someone coming in going through a transition. You might have, in this day and age, someone might have been diagnosed with something at home. I mean, I think as leaders, we need to check in and be empathetic and realize that, people have lives and things going on outside of work. But we need to make sure that we have that safe space for them in the work environment to be comfortable, to fully contribute so that ultimately the organization is getting the best out of that person.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, it's interesting when you bring up imposter syndrome and things. If you don't feel that sense of safe space, to your point, you aren't going to speak up. And then there's that loss, right, of some great ideas. And that's a great segue into my next question for the group, which is, sometimes managers accidentally undermine those relationships, right? They may really unintentionally create places and spaces that are not safe feeling or not engaging. And so what are just some quick things that, and this is, anybody can chime in to think about in addition to, we talked about the imposter syndrome, but other things. I'd be curious to hear the group's thoughts of things that managers should really look to avoid and to ensure that we don't undermine those relationships.
I would start with communication and transparency, trying to share what you can when you can. I have found when people, I don't know if this is always intentional, but sometimes people hold information too close to the vest for too long. And then the team feels left out and they feel like, I've noticed particularly like millennials and Gen X and Gen Z, they really want to be in the know. And obviously you can't tell them everything, but when you're holding information back and it doesn't seem to be a reason why, I think that can erode trust. And you could undermine someone's ability to actually plan more effectively. Like, I don't like to deprive people of their opportunity to plan, and I don't like to mismanage people's expectations. I think when you erode that trust, it could be a cancer on the team because now I don't know, back to what we were talking about earlier, does my manager have my back? Because they're keeping this key information from me that would allow me to be successful. So it's almost like you're trying to make me fail, or that if it's pattern forming, it can certainly feel that way. So I think I like to truly manage expectations, share what I can share when I can share it, and then tell people when I can't, why I can't. And so I think by being truly authentic with my team, then and that trust is there, then I think they'll accept me for the word when I can or can't do something. But I think if you can't establish that trust, I do think you're undermining your team's ability to perform.
Yeah. Kate, any thoughts from you?
I guess the one thing that comes to mind is second guessing the team. If you give them autonomy and you say you trust them, but then you start monitoring keystrokes or micromanaging, that trust is going to go out the window. And the thing is, if we treat people like children, they're going to start to act like them and they're going to stop thinking for themselves. Is that what we really want? Something like 70% of companies now monitor their employees in some ways, whether it's counting keystrokes, whether it's having a persistent video that they can look at. That's not managing, that's babysitting.
Yeah, we actually did get a question. And so Bernard, I'm going to pose this to you. Bernard, how do you track and manage increased engagement? Do you all have technology and cadences that support cross-functional collaboration, accountability, and alignment? The factors that play into engagement. So we've got that question I want to be sure we asked. Bernard, how do you track engagement?
So we use engagement surveys. I suggest doing it at a regular clip, maybe twice a year, 3 times a year. Some people do like those big organization-wide surveys. Some people do like week-over-week pulses. There's no right or wrong cadence. I just think you should be asking consistent questions over and over again, so that way you can get signal quarter over quarter, year over year, month over month, whatever your cadence. And then I think you should have like clear, understood areas that you're looking at. So like, what are you looking to know? It's like the worst thing about doing surveys is not doing anything about it.
Right.
I've been in organizations where it feels very big brother and I'm just looking over your shoulder and suggestions are being made and insights are had, but nothing ever comes of it. So if you're going to do surveys, also be willing to take actions on it. Like, I look at things like, Do I feel like I'm growing? Do I have a supportive manager? Do I have trust in the team? Is there a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? A lot of those things we'll talk to whether once someone's going to stay or go. Like there's one directly correlated to belonging scores. Like if I feel like I don't belong, I'm going to go where I do belong, right? And I think Marie and Kate talked about talented people have options, and they will leave if they don't feel it. So I think it's really important to understand how your teams and the company's doing, because those tell you where like you should improve upon it. And then read the comments. Like the open box comments are your friend. I like to read that and understand like exactly what people are feeling, and I can kind of pinpoint and then put solutions in place to help people get out of their own way if it's like a manager being that bottleneck. And then the question about the technology and cadences. I think there's lots of different types of technology you can use. Like Slack is something we use at work, but like there's Slack, there's email, but whatever your way of working, that's important. But I think it's important to also stress cross-functional work, right? I think with distributed teams, there's a lot of silos that can occur. Are you as a manager, are you as a company talking about why we need to do things in a cross-functional manner? I think it's more so, not so much the tooling, but the messaging and the actions around making sure people are working in a cross-functional way versus like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, and thus just become super ineffective because we're both doing the same thing when we should have been doing it together.
Right. No, I think that's so true. And communicating is just so key to setting expectations. And they say you have to communicate, 5 or 6 times before things can really settle in, and people can really absorb and also start transitioning towards whatever that new policy is or whatever that change is going to be. Marie, I'm curious from your perspective, and you're in an organization that's really large and communicating across thousands of employees. How do you feel? How do you introduce new policies? How do you communicate that across and make sure that the messages, the change in policies is getting across, but also still, keeping that sense of engagement and belonging and people feeling that they are in a safe place? All from that whole perspective, I'm just curious, what your experience has been.
So great question. And I'm going to say this: transparency is key, and employee engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the first thing, especially when you're introducing new policies, you really need to capture that voice of your employees in that policy. And so you do it one or two ways. You really take the time to listen to employees, survey them, test them, get their feedback on those policies, so that you can have some of these employees as some of those folks helping to be change agents to help with because when you introduce something new and you have these policies, I think it can be challenging for leaders when they introduce them right off the bat. I think secondly, also, you have to, again, keep listening to that voice of the customer, your employee. So looking at data, I think Bernard touched on this, the employee surveys are really important. Putting questions in there that get to some of those policies, talking about inclusion, looking at employee sentiment, even looking outside of your organization and what you're hearing on social media. That also will tell a story as well, just because sometimes employees don't tell the truth through some of those surveys. And so it's really important for organizations to do that pulse checking, just to make sure that what they are doing is the right thing to do. And then again, also engaging your employees in some of those policies. I think honestly, that is the way that is going to help, I think, get the buy-in from employees, because again, they have options and they have places that they can be anywhere now that you can do hybrid or remote. And so I think it's really important as you go on this journey to really empower and include your employees as part of that decision making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more. Having the change agents, having those individuals amplify the message, and share with other employees that this is okay and the journey that we're on is a good one and we're getting to a great place is so key as we go, as any organization thinks about it, making any changes. Kate, has that been your experience as well? Is there anything you would like to add to Marie's excellent points?
No, they were very good points, and especially the involving them. I just read a 100+ page study from O.C. Tanner yesterday on engagement and culture. And I can't remember the number, but it was something like people are 300% more likely to support an initiative that they had some say in.
Mm.
So, get that voice, do the town halls, do the focus groups, do the surveys, share the results of the surveys, for transparency. And the other thing I think is whenever you're delivering a message, you've got to give them the why and the with them. What's in it for me? Right. And that's our first reaction. Okay, what's this going to mean to me? What's in it for me? When companies were starting to come out with their policies about what they were going to do post-pandemic, there was a lot of pushback. And I mean, this was like late 2020, early 2021, Capital One came out with their policy, and it was that they were going to bring people back 3 days a week. I think it was 3, maybe 2. But they didn't get the pushback that so many others did, because it was just, it was beautifully written. And it went all through, here's how we came to the decision. These are the things that we're worried about. This isn't a hard and fast policy. We're going to work through this and see how things work. But, for now, we think this is the best way to, it was just beautiful.
Yeah, no, and I remember there were some companies who had to backtrack on some of the policies that they came out with because they weren't as transparent on how they reached their decisions. And Bernard, I would love to get your thoughts. You've made some excellent points today in terms of transparency, but I'm curious to get your perspective of what should a company do if the policies aren't well received by employees. How can employees raise concerns, but better yet, what should a company do in that moment?
Yeah, I think, it's still an interesting market. So I think employers are very much used to when they had all the say and the employees just had to kind of deal with it. And with such an interesting job market and 500,000 jobs created the January Department of Labor report, it's a fascinating dynamic. So I do think you have to listen more carefully, right? And I think kind of to Kate's point on the Capital One, like you come out and say, hey, that didn't work. To go back to the drawing board, and I would go through those motions again, the focus groups talking. I would use people's ideas. If those are good ones, co-opted, they're going to definitely be bought in. Like if I see my idea in print in real life, I'm going to be really happy. Right. And then that way we're going to have a more willing audience, and they're like, okay, they're reasonable. They understood it didn't work out. They're trying to get this right. I think people would appreciate that much more than like, we're doubling down now. It's 5 days a week, and I just don't think it's going to play like it used to. So people have to get much more creative, be much more collaborative, and very, very intentional and thoughtful if this is going to work.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Bernard, I'm going to give you the last comment for this panel, and I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. We've come to the end of our 16th Dialogue for Change. Thank you to this excellent panel. It's been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I just want to say to everyone out there, please look for follow-up emails from Invariant for more details about Dialogue for Change speaker series and additional diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging resources. Know that you can also find us on Twitter at Invariant and of course on LinkedIn. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Great conversation.
Thanks.
Thank you.